I would like to thank Enrico Deaglio, of course, very much. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Mark Axelrod, a friend of many years. I mean, it's been a long collaboration from Chapman University for their collaboration too. And in a special thanks to Italian Culture Institute Attaché Leonilde Callocchia for organizing this very special event. Thank you, Hilde. And thank you all for being here tonight. As a courtesy to others, we kindly ask you to turn off or silence now your cell phones for the whole duration of the presentation. Please take a moment also to join the Italian Culture Institute as a member, if you're not a member yet, or to renew your membership for very special members-only events. We would also like to invite you to our next Meet Italy event, which is a platform of Italian and Italian-American executives engaged in the fields of media, entertainment, economy, science, and technology. We will have the honor to host our next keynote speaker, Maurizio Vecchione, Executive Vice President of the Global Good Fund and Research at Intellectual Ventures. The event will be held on March the 7th. We are also delighted to organize on March the 19th the Italian Design Day in the world, and we'll have a very special ambassador, Luisa Cevese, who was also present at the in Palm Springs at the Design Museum with a very special exhibition, Scraps, on using scrap materials, and so it's very. We also have here a show by Luisa Cevese. It is now with very great pleasure that I introduce Mark Axelrod, Professor of Comparative Literature in the Department of English at Chapman University and also Director of John Fowles Center for Creative Writing. At last count, he has written over 125 volumes of prose, poetry, drama, film, and literary criticism. And in 2017, he was inducted into the European Academy of Arts and Science in Salzburg. Now, please join me in giving a very warm round of applause to Mark Axelrod. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Okay. Well, I certainly like to thank the Institute for this invitation. It's wonderful to be here again. And so tonight, what I'm basically going to do is ask, what's your name? Yeah, some questions about his book and his books, his new one and his new ones, as well as his old ones. And then after a while, we'll kind of open the floor up to any questions you may have. Okay. So since not everyone here may be aware of the story of Perlasca, whose story is the basis for your book, The Banality of Goodness, perhaps you could give a brief backstory of how you came to meet him, how you decided to write about him, and how you selected the title Banality of Goodness.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody who came. Thank you for the invitation from the Italian Cultural Institute. And this gives me the opportunity to tell you about this book that for me has been very important. And it still is a sort of important book for the literature about Holocaust in Italy. It tells the story of an unknown man that I sort of discovered accidentally, who was an Italian businessman who lived in Budapest, and in the final months of the war, while the deportation of the Jews was ravaging, he took some initiative, and he acted as the consul of Spain in Budapest, which of course he was not. He was an imposter, and he acted like that. If he had been discovered, of course, he would have been killed. And he managed to save with this opportunity, something like 5,000 Jews of the city of Budapest, protecting them in tall buildings in the center of the city, organizing them to resist, and waiting for the end of the war so they could be freed. Well, I discovered this story in a very strange way. It was 1989, and 1989 for Italy and for Europe and for the world was the year of the end of the Berlin Wall and the initial collapse of all the communist regimes in Eastern Europe. And so everybody was taken. I was a journalist at the time. I worked for the Italian TV, and we were all, interested in what was happening at the East. And a friend of mine who lived in Israel came to Roma, my city, and he told the story. Look, that maybe there is something that is going to be interesting to you because you have a hero in Italy and you don't know it. And he told the story of this man, Giorgio Perlasca, this is his name, who had been honored in Israel with the major honor possible. It was given him an Israeli passport. He was named righteous among the nation. And he went there, the parliament clapped for him, and all these things. And really, nobody knew it. Nobody knew this story. And the story was that just after the collapse of the communist regime, when some, let's call it, liberty of press was permitted, there was the paper of the Jewish community in Budapest put a little notice saying, if anybody remembers or have some material that regards the Spanish consul, Jorge Perlasca, who helped the Jewish community in Budapest, please come here, come to the office and show up, etc. And many people came bringing false certificates or photographs or witnesses, etc. They sent everything to Yad Vashem, which is the institution in Israel that want to honor the people who saved Jews during the Second World War, during the Holocaust, and immediately Israel honored him. And so this was the story that my friend told me. But the fact is that nobody cared. I remember that nobody had noticed in Italy. Nobody interviewed this guy. Nobody knew even who he was, etc. And I was sort of puzzled why this thing was so. Why this thing was not noticed, And to understand why is to understand many things. The Holocaust in that time, in the 80s, in the end of the 80s, was not known as it is now, especially in Italy. We had a few studies. We didn't have a perception of what really happened. We didn't have a responsibility as Italians of what happened to the Italian Jews. And nobody knew, for example, the figures. In Italy, 45,000 Jews lived before the war, let's say, before the starting of the war. 8,500 of these 45,000 were deported from Italy to the concentration camps, and something like 95% of them were killed in the concentration camps. But we used to, in Italy, sort of blame only the Germans for that, not taking responsibility for what the Italian officer, policeman, organization, etc., what the laws permitted, that permitted and organized the deportation of the Jews. And here came a man who instead had done, terrific things, terrific, heroic acts, and so there was a sort of, I would say, thinking of that after a while, it was a little bit embarrassing, because this man, who was a common man, could do so many things, so many good deeds that anyone in Italy had done, having the possibilities to do. So this is the beginning of the story. And so I went to Padua. This guy was living in Padua. He had an address. And I wanted to meet him to see what was his story. And the first fact was that it was not not easy to reach him, because he was so poor, this guy, so modest and so poor, that he didn't have a telephone, a landline telephone. So to reach him, you had to call his sister. And his sister used to take the call and put clip a magazine on the balcony to show her brother, when he came for a walk, they were old people, he was 80 years old, that somebody was looking for him. So he could ring the bell to the sister, and who called. So anyway, at the end, I found him, and I went to Padua, and I found this man. As I said, he was 80 years old, in a very modest house, and I asked him, what happened? And the first thing he told me was, what have you done in my place? That was a strange thing. And he said, I saw that people were killed, I saw that people were deported, I saw that the violence, the arrogance and everything, and I tried to do something. And I had the possibility of doing something. I had it because the circumstances were favorable to me. I was in my youth, I was a strong man, I had possibilities, and I invented myself a role. And this role was to be a Spanish consul. Why? Because the guy was a fascist. He was a fascist, Mr. Perlasca, convinced fascist, and he fought for the fascist regime, the Italian fascist regime in Spain. The Italian fascist regime sent something like 80,000 soldiers to help Francisco Franco to win against the Republic. And they did. And they bombed Spain and all, the story, the Spanish Civil War. And he was one of them. And so he was a militant fascist. But he couldn't stand what he saw. He couldn't stand what he saw in Hungary, the persecution of the Jews, etc. And he decided to do something. So he went to the Spanish embassy in Budapest, and you have to remember that Spain was neutral during the Second World War. The Spanish regime didn't participate to the Nazi and fascist alliance, and he went there and he said if they could help him, first of all to save himself, because at the time Mussolini has already fallen, and second, if he could do something to help. And they gave him a passport because he had been a Spanish fighter. That's so strange, but that really happened. And they gave him a passport, and he began to work, because the Spanish embassy in Budapest has a sort of a program to save or to intervene in favor of the Jews who were of Sephardic origin, so Spanish origin. And so he did. But then suddenly, the ambassador of Spain, it was December 1944, decided that his role there wasn't possible anymore. The city was bombed all the day. The Soviet army was arriving. He had no possibility of having any kind of diplomatic role, and so he left. And he said to Perlasca, he said, if you want to come to me, we go. We have a diplomatic way to come out of the country, and we can go to Switzerland, and then from Switzerland you can go back to Italy. And Perlasca decided to stay. And in a sort of trance moment, he said to me he didn't understand himself what he was doing, but he went to the Hungarian government and announced that he himself was the new consul of Spain. And you have to think that things were so, nothing functioned there. There were no possibility of sending telegrams, of having phone calls, of having all this kind of, everything was isolated. So they took it for granted. They said, okay, you're the news. And he went back to the embassy. There were some clerks there, some employees, etc. And they decided he told them the story, and the guys there said, okay, let's do something. So he began this action, which was something of the most adventurous stories I ever heard before. He became an organizer. He became, he found money. He put himself in contact with the church, with underground people, etc. He defended these buildings where all the Jews were amassed there, protected them. They were armed. So he did. It was sort of a saga, It was something incredible. And he resisted till the Soviet army came in and all was finished and people were freed, etc. And he himself had a hard time to come back to Italy. It took a year to come back to Italy, and he tried to tell the story when he was in Italy, and nobody believed it. That was it. Nobody cared, first of all. And nobody believed it, so after a while, he stopped telling it, And he had a very modest life, and he small jobs and things, etc., and that was it. That was finished. Till 1989, in which, they had this possibility in Hungary, and many of the people who had been saved by him, that were at the time young people, especially young girls, remembered this person and wanted to do something for him. And that was the beginning of all his second life, that unfortunately for him lasted only 2 or 3 years, because he died for a heart attack in 1993. But it was a big satisfaction for him to
right.
So this is the theme of the book.
The book has a number of micro histories in it. So, and some of these micro histories are micro narratives are rather fascinating. One of the most fascinating, at least from my perspective, was the story about the twins, right? And so I thought maybe you could share that with them, since it truly is a very fascinating story.
I like the story very much. And the story is this: the deportation of the Hungarian Jews from the city of Budapest was organized by Adolf Eichmann in person. And it was very scientifically organized, and people were amassed that were caught in raids, etc., or coming from the countryside, brought to the capital, and then put on the trains, and they were going especially to Auschwitz. In 1944, all the new Jews that arrived in Auschwitz concentration camp were Hungarian. They were all Hungarian. If the war was ended something like when Hitler had his attempt, if the war ended there had been 1 million Jews would have been saved, and half of them would have been Hungarian. And so they went to the station, and they put them on the train to go to Poland. And Perlasca was there as a consul, and other consuls of neutral countries were there, because at the end of the 1944, the situation was so everybody knew everything, and so the Swiss consul was there, the Vatican representative was there, the Swedish envoy, the famous Raoul Wallenberg, were all there at the station trying to stop, or to do something, to take somebody out of this thing, save some people. And Perlasca told me that he had this adventure that at a certain point he saw two twins, a boy and a girl, who were something like 10 years old. And he sort of had an emotional feeling, and he said, I have to save them. And so he jumped over, to take these two boys, by the boy and the girl, and he put them in his car. And his car was the official car of the Spanish embassy. It was a big car, and it was with, the Spanish flags and things, and he had guards. So and he put these two young boys in the car and said, stay there and close yourself inside. And then the Germans arrived, a major arrived there and said, you have to give me these people, you have to, you're committing a crime, etc. And he was shouting, saying, no, this is the territory of Spain. This is not Hungary. This is, I have the right to do that. And said, no, so everybody came there, etc. Then a guy arrived, he was a sort of big officer, and he said, what's happening here? German. And the major explained, oh, this is, and so he said, you have to give us this children. And Perlasca again tell his story. Perlasca could speak languages. He could speak German. He could speak some Hungarian. He could speak beautiful Spanish. That's important. And he could explain the situation to this officer. And the officer said to him, "You are disturbing my business." And Perlasca said, "And you call this your business?" And the officer said, "Okay, lead them. The moment will come. The moment will come also for these two." And he went away. So the boy and the girl were saved. But then, when all the scene that had been very dramatic finished, all the other people who were there went to Perlasca and said, "Do you know who was that guy?" He was Eichmann. And Perlasca said, "If I knew it, I wouldn't dare to say this thing." And that is the story of the two twins. That has a little epilogue. When he came back in the 50s, in the early 50s, a local paper in Italy interviewed him, and he told the story of the two twins. And so one night, he was living in Padua, he received a visit of two people who came from Germany, who were sent by the lawyer of Eichmann, who died in Jerusalem, 1961, asking him if he wanted to come to Jerusalem to witness in favor of Eichmann. Because they said, well, Eichmann showed some humanity because he left the two children. And Perlasca said, "No, look, really, not going to do that thing," etc. No? And this is the story, and then everything stopped. But it didn't have any resonance anywhere. And he remembered that thing, and he told me that when he was honored in Hungary, something like 40 years after, he thought he recognized the two twins. Yeah. He was not sure, but he thought it. They didn't recognize him.
Well, here we are in Los Angeles, which is the land of film and honey. And so I thought I would ask, adaptations from books to films are often fraught with problems, right?
Yeah.
Actor problems, director problems, screenwriting problems. So what do you recall of the adaptation of your book into the film?
Well, first of all, the story was this: the book became a bestseller. It was translated. It had a lot of attention, and it touched some emotions. It touched nerves about it. Although the story was very difficult to tell because Hungary was a so complex place, so far, so complicated, etc., and the things were so coming back in time. And he himself was not a person, he was a fascist, so he was not exactly the kind of the hero you expected. But anyway, we had a lot of how would you say, proposals for a movie, and unfortunately, I say unfortunately, on an egoistic point of view, Schindler's List came first. Schindler's List came first, and it was in a certain way the same story. So you had a person, Schindler was a Nazi member of the party, and Perlasca was a fascist, etc. That was in Poland, that was in Hungary. But anyway, this was the first thing, so it didn't become a big international movie, but it became a big movie for the Italian state television, who decided to produce it. And it became a 2-episode that was broadcasted in prime time, and we were absolutely nervous of thinking of a big flop, and it was the biggest success in the Italian television in these years. It's an action film. The movie that if you want to see it, it has been on Netflix for a lot of time. Now you can have it in Amazon Prime. You have it here. It's a good movie. I like it. It's an action movie, and the Perlasca is played by a very famous Italian actor called Luca Zingaretti, who is the actor. He's famous because he plays a police officer called the Commissario Montalbano. Maybe somebody knows him. That is the biggest success in Italian TV from 20 years. And so the difficulties were, well, to make the story understandable, first of all, because it was not simple to make it. To show how the strange place of Hungary was. And it was a beautiful time for me. I participated to the preparation of the film, the screenplay and everything, etc. And for example, the one thing that was very important was to go and film it in the real Budapest, where the thing happened. And in 2000, when the film was made, Budapest was exactly as it was in 1944. Nothing had changed. The buildings were there, the streets were the same, and that was very important. And the people were the same. And I remember there is a scene in the movie when you had all the women who are deported with the little children in the, how do you call it, in the stalls. And I remember that the stalls of the 40s, the production found them, and you have all the scene and the dresses and everything, etc. And it was really something moving to recreate all that atmosphere. Yeah, that was really interesting. And then things now are different. Budapest is a completely different town, and it couldn't have been possible. Yeah. That was the first thing. The other thing that I remember, that some good tips were given us from Tony Curtis. Now this is a strange story because in Budapest there is the biggest synagogue in Europe is the synagogue of Doani Ulica. The central one of the central streets in Budapest had this huge, enormous synagogue. And the synagogue was destroyed, etc., and damaged and run down, etc. And one of the people who intervened in putting a lot of money in restoring the synagogue in the 70s, in the 80s, etc., was Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis' real name was Mr. Schwartz. He was an Hungarian Jew. He was born in America, in the Bronx, but his father was there, and he fought in the Second World War without knowing that he was a Jew. And he knew it after. And he knew all his father's story, and his father told him that he was living in the countryside in Hungary, and when he came to the city, the first thing he did was going to the synagogue and going to the temple and pray, etc., and then start his business, etc. And so he put a lot of money, and he knew the story of Perlasca, and he wanted to put a plaque in the synagogue, which was there from the beginning, from this gentleman Perlasca, as he called him. And he gave some tips for the movie. And he said, it has to be action, only action, only action. And it has to be one man against the whole city. And so we did it.
Well, I have one major question I want to ask. Yeah. We can talk about some of your newer work. You close your book talking about the philosopher Hannah Arendt and her 1963 study of the trial, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Last March, in a formal speech commemorating the 170th anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848, President Orban said the following, I'm quoting, "They, the Jews, do not fight directly but by stealth. They are not honorable but unprincipled. They are not national but international. They do not believe in work but speculate with money. They have no homeland but feel that the whole world is theirs. They are not generous but vengeful and always attack the heart, especially if it is red, white, and green, the colors of the Hungarian flag." So my question I have for you now is a speculative one. Do you think the Jews of Hungary should start packing their bags again?
They're already doing it. Yeah. And I have to tell you that I saw Hungary changing because I was a frequent visitor to Hungary during the book making, etc. And I spent there I went there many times. And then I went for preparing the movie, and then I went for presentation, and then I went, with the Perlasca family. We were all involved in this thing. Perlasca is very honored. Now now I don't know exactly what Orban is going to do because he's taking physically off all, plaques and statues and things. And I remember that in the first years there was a sort of free spirit and attitude in the country. But then this thing of the anti-Semitism started again. I remember I saw in the 90s, half 90s, etc., a demonstration in Budapest, quite a lot of people protesting because there were too many Jews in the state television as journalists. And I remember when we were there, and for example, we wanted to interview some people who were saved, who had been saved by Perlasca, etc. And the people, yes, liked to be interviewed, etc. But they said, don't do it in a public space. I don't want people to see me. Things like that. There was a sort of fear. So it was balanced. And now comes this Orban, who, you know who he is. He's the strong man of Hungary, and he's declaring his anti-Semitism. He says what you heard, and he said Hungary has not to be a liberal country. It's not a democracy. It has to go back to the old Catholic and Magyar identity, and in this Magyar identity there is no place for Jews, and there is no place for immigrants. So they have to go away. And it's incredible. It's a big problem in Europe for the European Union. He's not a democratic person. And his main target is this famous philanthropist millionaire called George Soros, who is Jewish, and who has universities, who has cultural presence, who has a lot of interest, etc. in Hungary and a lot of places. And he's become the first enemy. His university has been closed. He has to move to Vienna, and so this is the situation. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, Orban has found an ally in the Italian government now, and this, if somebody is interested in this thing, it's really an alarm. We had our vice premier who received Orban in Milano and said, we share everything you think. We share the Magyar identity. Now, why should Italians share a Magyar identity? What do we have to do with that? But this is the sort of thing that is happening under our eyes. So the latest figures said that 150,000 Hungarians have left the country. It's a small country, Hungary. Have left the country in the last year. And I don't know, nobody knows now who is Jewish, who is not, etc., but there probably are. And what happened in the period before that was that the Jews who could escape before the Holocaust were a lot. And I can say they built the city because Hollywood was made by Hungarian Jews. Producers, actors, directors, etc., they all came from Budapest. And so this is something that relates to the modern times.
So why don't you just say a little bit about your new work, right?
Yeah.
And then we'll take some questions if there are any.
No, I want, if you could just see how Perlasca was. That he was a very tall guy, and he was a handsome guy when he was young. He was 34 at the time of his action, and he had blue eyes, blonde hair. He is before, a few months before his death, and this is him. And he was very charming, very charming.
So talk a little about your newest works.
Yeah. Well, I've done many things after that, etc.
Right.
And Valeria just said I'm still a journalist, and I still write in papers, and I do this thing. But there's two books I would like to talk about because they have to do with this country where I live from now 8 years. And the first book is the story. I'm sort of I am interested in the story of unknown people that did something important, etc. And the first story is the story of 5 Sicilian peasants who emigrated to Louisiana and Mississippi in a wave of emigration from Italy at the end of the 19th century because they were coming to substitute the slaves. They were freed after the Civil War, so the plantation of sugar and cotton, they needed new slaves, let's say, in a certain way, and they called the Sicilians. And this is a story. Something like 20,000 Sicilians came to this country. And they were the 20% of the population of New Orleans. And these 5 people, they were 3 brothers and 2 cousins, and they came all from the very ancient town of Cefalù in Sicily, which is famous because of the big cathedral. It's a famous historic city. And they survived the plantation, and they started a little job like grocery vendors. They were street vendors with a cart, and then they went up in the northern Louisiana in a little village close to the Mississippi River, and they were there, and they were street vendors, and they were living there for 6 years. in 1899, and they were sort of businessmen. They had become businessmen in this little town. They went to the photographer. They had a photo, with the dress and things. They sent it home, and they were all lynched in a certain day, 1899, because they had some goats, and one of the goats went into the property of the doctor of this little village. And the doctor shot the goat. And the Sicilian said, "You shouldn't have shoot my goat." And so all the good people of this little place, little village, Tallulah, rounded up the Sicilian and lynched them, saying that they were conspiring against I don't know what. And it was an international case, and at the end, the American Congress said that the family of these 5 Sicilian had to be recompensated, and they offered $2,000 each. But then they say, well, there were 5, and they said, but 2 of them had asked to have the American citizenship. So they were no more Italian, so they are not subject to the protection of the King of Italy, so we take out this 2. So they gave us only to 2 family at the end. But this is a story. It's a very tragic story, but I found out that I did a lot of research on that, and it's a kind of modern story, because it tells the story of this big immigration, of the Sicilian to this country, in a place which is now Sicily is the location of the biggest immigration from Africa. They all come to Sicily, and because it's the nearest place, and we had something like 20,000 people who drowned in the last 10 years in the Mediterranean. They come in with these little rafts, etc., and they die every day from now 10, 15 years. So this is my story. It's called A Terrible History Between Sicily and America. Terrible story, a true and terrible history between Sicily and America. This is one of the 5 peasants. He put his best dress. That was some weeks before he was lynched.
But the novel is kind of an American story too.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. And the second one it's a novel, and it just came out, by the way. It's called Auntie Irene and the Anarchist Tresca. So the Anarchist Tresca is a real person. He was a very famous Italian anarchist who lived in New York, Carlo Tresca, very popular, very important figure, who was shot in 1943 on the Fifth Avenue. And somebody noted that there's another guy who said recently that I can shoot anybody on the Fifth Avenue, I can get away with it without anybody saying nothing to me. And that would happen to the people who killed Carlo Tresca, in fact, because nobody ever knew who killed this person. And there were 3 possible solutions of the case. One was a revenge of Mussolini, one was the Sicilian Mafia, and one was the Communist Party. So it was a range of people who was very interested in killing this man. So my novel starts with this Auntie Irene, who had been a spy for in the secret services, who she gives this suitcase full of documents to her nephew to make an inquiry. In this cold case, it's set now, and this story develops in the new situation. So we find it very financial plot and things, etc. And a lot of things happens, and which are very, very to me funny and interesting, etc. So this is my last thing.
So maybe there's some questions out there. If there are, then I'm sure we can.
Are these 2 translated?
Not yet. No, not yet.
No, actually, I'm going to try to get the novel published for him in English. Yeah. Everyone's quiet.
When you were introducing the story of Perlasca earlier, you mentioned that no one in Italy knows about it, and I can confirm it. I come from Italy as well, and I never heard about him earlier. And I was wondering, has anyone attempted at any time to understand how many stories such as Perlasca's we have around and of which we don't know anything?
Can you say it again?
Sure.
Exactly.
Whether they were not necessarily Italian ones, or are you talking about
not
Italian?
necessarily, no, but...
No. So when he was talking about other stories like Perlasca's.
Oh.
Right? And so remember last night...
On the subject of the Holocaust?
Yes, I mean...
yeah.
I mean, I suppose there are many, but somehow it's surprising that most of them are probably unknown. I think one that I know is Gino Bartali.
Sure.
He was pretty
the famous cyclist, yeah.
Yes, and he was famous for smuggling passports or something for Jews. But I don't know if it's...
There are many. There are many. Many Italians, something like 25 Italians, are honored by Yad Vashem in Jerusalem as artists to the nations. And these stories came out in the last years, in fact. And I would say, in general, that, 8,500 were deported, but probably another 10,000 were saved by people, by ordinary people, by priests, most of them by priests in Italy. So there was, this kind of humanity that the Italian people showed in those times. In the same time, the embarrassing situation is that no institution, no official institution in Italy opposed the Holocaust. There was no police officers, no magistrate, no person in the government, etc., that opposed this. The thing that happened in other countries, In other countries you had some opposition. In Italy you didn't have. So this is a double farce situation. But what is really to me important is to show that the Perlasca story shows that there is a possibility, always a possibility, even in the most unfavorable situation, to do something, and to do it with creativity. This story of Perlasca, he was nobody, and he found a new role. He invented himself, and this is something very, very interesting. You quoted Bartali. Bartali was a famous cyclist, very famous, a hero, etc. And nobody ever knew this thing, but he used to practice with his big bicycle, and he used to put documents inside the bicycle, the metal, etc., and certificates and documents, etc. And he did all these hundreds of kilometers every day, etc., bringing documents, taking it, and he never said anything. That's another thing. He never boasted, I did this, etc. And after years, after his death, they found out what they did. There was another guy he's honored too. He was a psychiatrist, and he had a hospital near my city, Torino, and he used to put inside the hospital and declaring mad people, something like 100 Jews went there, and he said, these are mad, etc., and saved them. And you had a lot of creativity, a lot of interest, but in the same time, you had this really hypocrisy of the Italian institution, official institution, to recognize what happened, and especially especially this. The history, as it is told, it says that, you know, the Italians are good people. We say Italiani brava gente. You know, the Germans did it all. The Italians didn't do it. It's not true. It's not true. Some Italians did it.
Right.
And there is another story that I discovered by chance. The father of Piero Angela,
Yeah, that's him.
the doctor
Yeah.
who changed the document.
Yeah.
When I discovered this story, I was impressed because
Right.
Piero Angela we know for Quark and other stuff. But I think it's another interesting story, not to tell.
Yeah, that's the story it was relating to. And the fact is that Piero Angelo doesn't want to talk about that.
No,
Yeah.
and this impressed me.
Yeah.
Why?
He doesn't want to. He said, "Oh, my father
Okay.
did that because."
Oh, no. I have a question about the situation in Italy and especially in Europe. What is your feeling, your fear? You spoke about Orban and our Vice Minister Matteo Salvini.
Yeah.
That the position of this guy scared me. And in general, the situation in Italy and in Europe
it's scary.
scared me. So what is your opinion in general?
Well, it's so beyond my kind of prediction. I couldn't really predict that something like that happened. Italy is now governed by a coalition made by two populist parties. One is called the Movimento 5 Stelle, the five-star movement that was founded by a comedian. This comedian is named Beppe Grillo. He was an old comedian, and he founded this movement, and he got 33% at the election. They are confused people. They don't know what they want. They are ignorant, if I may say my opinion. And the second leg of this coalition is a very fascist and racist party that coming from the Northern League, and its leader is a guy called Matteo Salvini, who now is something like 33% in the polls. This is Italy now. The Matteo Salvini, who is the strong man in this government, closed the harbors to the immigrants, had a law passed that doesn't guarantee any kind of political asylum to anybody. He's taken away the immigrants from the shelters where they were. He promised that he wants to go against Europe. He made an alliance with the Hungarian government and the Polish, who are in the same position of the Hungarians. And so this is absolutely scary. I mean, it looks like Italy is becoming something like it's going away from Europe. And by the way, the economic situation is not good. We are in an economic recession. So it's kind of a very difficult and to me scaring situation. Beyond my imagination. Now we will have European elections in May, as everybody knows, and so there is a possibility that the Italian vote for the anti-Europe parties, you know, and that you could have, we hope not, I hope not, we could have really a different situation in Europe that sees a majority in the European Parliament expression of this populist and racist movement in Europe, from Austria, part of Germany, Poland, Hungary, Italy, Romania. So this we are living in a very scaring, to me, I'm always talking for myself, scaring and confusing situation.
Any others? Well, if not, I guess we can say thank you for coming.